welcome from the Hoover Institution, Todd Lindbergh.
Thanks, David. Thanks to Cato for putting on this event. Thanks to you all for coming. Thanks to Brad for getting the party started. You will have gathered that Neoconservatism, An Obituary for an Idea, is a polemical book. We can get into some of the specifics a little bit later. I guess I'll start with a note of autobiography. In 1982, when I left the University of Chicago, when I was leaving the University of Chicago, I had two possible destinations. One was to go up to Toronto. Alan Bloom had arranged the possibility of my study there with a couple of his fellow members of his school, Tom Pangle and Clifford Orwin. The other path was to go work for Irving Kristol at the Public Interest in New York. Now, I used to think that that represented a choice and a difference, but I'm not sure now, having been enlightened by Professor Thompson on the subject, that there really was any such difference. The subtitle of the book is An Obituary for an Idea, and this is an interesting subtitle in many respects, not least because I think, if the premise of that is that neoconservatism is dead, which, as you can see, there's a tombstone on the cover of the book. I think it's quite likely that, zombie-like, the neoconservatives are going to dig themselves up again. And this precise sense in which Brad has described what he means by an obituary is in a way sort of prospective. He talks about Charlotte Corday writing Marat's obituary on her way to Paris. He does not elaborate. I will spare you your trip to Google on your iPhone. Charlotte Corday, of course, killed Marat in Paris. So I think the aspiration of the book is to produce the condition that the cover depicts, namely the death of the neoconservatism as an intellectual strain. This will, however, I think, be a pretty big project, because I was asking, well, how, what all would have to die in order for neoconservatism to disappear as an intellectual strain. And I started making a little list, and it seemed to me that the Wall Street Journal editorial page would have to go, the Weekly Standard would have to go, Commentary Magazine would have to go, the publication National Affairs would have to go, the New Atlantis would have to go, large chunks of National Review would have to go. I think there might even be a couple of people at the Heritage Foundation who might have to go. The American Enterprise Institute, gone. Hudson Institute, now gone. The Ethics and Public Policy Center, out. Obviously, a few people at the Hoover Institution. Other institutions have not gone uncontaminated by this tendency. Bob Kagan sits at the Brookings Institution now, so that's obviously going to be a problem. And Elliot Abrams is at the Council on Foreign Relations, of all places. And I guess, since I'm not trying to be comprehensive, but the Washington Post editorial page is the home of Charles Krauthammer. So I guess there's a whole lot of killing that is going to have to go on in order for this vision of the death of neoconservatism to be realized. And I think that's where my work on preventing mass atrocities and genocide in another context may come in handy, because we certainly want, I would certainly hate to see this degree of carnage wrought upon the American intellectual landscape. I think the better question actually is the persistence of neoconservatism. Why has this tendency been around for so long? And I think I would like to take an opportunity to try to offer a little bit of a sense of an answer to that. But first, let's go back. Neoconservatives, as they tell the story, tend to trace the origins of the movement to, they may be lying, of course, but they tend to trace the origin of the movement to the founding of the Public Interest in the middle of the 1960s. And then, basically you have a number of disaffected academics, mainly social scientists, asking pragmatic questions about how the world works and publishing critiques of the Great Society programs of Lyndon Johnson, et cetera, in the Public Interest. Meanwhile, of course, the New Left is in full bloom in the 1960s, and that causes a reaction among a number of other people, and eventually results in the great turn that Commentary magazine took, not suddenly, but within the space of a few years in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and the emergence of Commentary as a major, the other major pole in the neoconservative universe, which of course grows and grows in influence up through the election of Reagan, and in whose administration neoconservatives, many of them, played a rather prominent role. And throughout this time, there was also, of course, a backlash against neoconservatives. Many traditional conservatives regarded neoconservatives as Johnny-come-latelys, as upstarts, as people who waltzed in only after the real conservatives have been making the serious arguments all along, and flashed their fancy social science data as if they just invented the wheel, when in fact the wheel had been invented long ago and had been turning nicely. And there was, of course, a fair bit of resentment. There were actually some fairly tough political struggles, actually, during the Reagan administration about what direction the Reagan administration would take in ideas matters. There was essentially a campaign. I mean, a war. I don't like war as a metaphor. I think war is war and shouldn't be recruited into discussions that are fundamentally peaceful. But there was certainly some back and forth over the question of whether Bill Bennett would become head of the National Endowment for Humanities or whether M.E. Bradford would, and that was an early distillation of a critique that I think continues to this day, and in Professor Thompson's book. But nevertheless, the neocon strain persisted and went on through the Reagan administration. The collapse of communism, I think, came as a surprise to most people, including the neocon Cold Warriors in town, who thought, as indeed I did when I moved here in 1985, that I would spend most of my life waging the Cold War in an effort to preserve the possibility, the actuality of freedom in America, and possibly to elsewhere around the world. But the collapse of communism brought in, I think, probably the most celebrated or notorious elements, I suppose, of the neoconservative argument, which was Francis Fukuyama's reflections on the end of history, and essentially raising the question of whether liberal democratic capitalism wasn't, in point of fact, a kind of final human answer to how the world ought to be organized. The thesis was much derided, much less was it actually read, and still less understood, but it was an interesting kind of intellectual moment. Meanwhile, I think you see what begins as a thought experiment that Charles Murray propounds in a book in the early 1980s, namely what would happen if we actually got rid of the welfare entitlement. It was posited as a thought experiment because no one could conceivably imagine such a proposal being taken seriously as a policy proposal when Charles first broached it in Losing Ground. By the mid-90s, it's becoming actually something that is a distinct political possibility. So you see Bill Clinton himself wanting to end welfare as we know it. Now, his emphasis was on as we know it, I think, which is to say he wanted to change it into something we would get to know and love more. But he kind of got tripped up by the election of Republican majorities in 1994, and they wanted to end welfare full stop. And after some back and forth, that actually happened. So in essence, you can see the way in which some of the ideas propounded by neoconservatives in neoconservative venues sort of became more or less merged with the mainstream of the Republican Party at about that time. And I think that has continued. Meanwhile, abroad, we have the extraordinary phenomenon of the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the breakup of the Soviet Union, and the